Brett and Ruby were driving home one night from visiting family, the darkness pressing against their windshield like black velvet. As they cruised down the long, desolate stretch of Dove Highway, they chatted back and forth, exchanging stories to pass the time. The road was nearly empty at this hour, with only the occasional pair of headlights breaking the monotony. "Have I ever told you about the ghost girl of Dove Highway?" Ruby asked suddenly, her voice taking on a hushed, conspiratorial tone. Brett glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. He shook his head. "Can't say you have." Ruby smiled, settling deeper into her seat. "A long time ago, maybe 30, 40 years back, a little girl went missing from her home. She was only 9 years old, with the brightest red hair you've ever seen. They say someone snatched her right from her front yard while she was playing. She never returned home." Ruby paused for effect. "People claim they still see her on this highway, always at night, always alone, trying to find her way back." Brett pursed his lips together, his jaw tightening slightly. "That's just a story folks used to tell to keep their kids from staying out too late. Like when they would tell us to be home and the streetlights turned on. Urban legends, honey, nothing more." Ruby pouted, crossing her arms. "Well, I think it's true. My grandmother knew the family. She said the mother never stopped looking, not until the day she died." "That's sad," Brett admitted, his tone softening. "But it doesn't make the ghost part real." The radio had been playing soft music in the background, but suddenly it began to fade and crackle with static, filling the car with an uncomfortable hiss. Ruby sighed, reaching forward to adjust the dial. "What's wrong with the radio?" "It's probably just electrical interference," Brett rationalized, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened imperceptibly. "We're in the middle of nowhere. Reception gets spotty." Ruby continued to fiddle with the knob, cycling through waves of static and fragmented voices. She let out a sharp gasp when it finally snapped back to normal. But what made her react wasn't the return of the music. It was the small figure standing on the side of the highway, illuminated briefly by their headlights. A little girl with bright red hair, wearing a faded yellow dress, stood motionless on the shoulder of the road. "Brett! There's a kid!" Ruby's voice cracked with concern. "I see her," Brett said quietly, his stomach twisting into a knot. He eased his foot off the gas pedal. "What's a kid doing out this late? It has to be past midnight," Ruby said, already unbuckling her seatbelt slightly as if preparing to help. Brett glanced at his wife, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Should we give her a ride? Something about this doesn't feel right." Ruby clicked her tongue and rolled her eyes. "Yes, of course we should. Brett, she's a child alone on a dark highway. What if something happens to her?" He couldn't argue with that logic, even though every instinct told him to keep driving. Brett slowed the car to a stop about 20 feet past where the girl stood. His wife pressed the button, and the window rolled down automatically with a soft whir. The young girl slowly walked over, her movements oddly fluid, almost gliding across the pavement. Up close, Ruby could see her pale skin, the unnatural brightness of her red hair, and her eyes, dark and hollow, like empty wells. "Hey, sweetie, do you need a ride home?" Ruby asked, forcing warmth into her voice despite the chill creeping up her spine. "Can you?" the girl said, her voice thin and distant. "I stayed out too late. My mom is going to be so worried." Ruby nodded quickly, trying to ignore the strangeness of the girl's fixed stare. "Of course, honey. Get in the back." The red-haired girl opened the rear door without a sound and slid into the middle seat, her small hands folding neatly in her lap. Brett watched through the rearview mirror as she settled in. "What's your name, kiddo?" The girl shifted slightly, her fingers brushing through her hair in a mechanical gesture. "Katrina," she whispered. The name hung in the air like a weight. Ruby felt her breath catch, but said nothing. "Where do you live, Katrina?" Brett asked, his voice carefully steady. "I'll show you." the girl said softly. "Turn left at the next road." They drove in silence, following Katrina's quiet directions. The girl spoke only to indicate turns, her voice never rising above a whisper. They traversed through different back roads that Ruby herself did not know existed, and she had grown up in this area. The landscape became increasingly unfamiliar, the trees pressing closer to the road, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the moonlight. "Ruby," Brett whispered, leaning slightly toward his wife. "Do you recognize any of this?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, I've never been down these roads. I didn't even know they were here." On the last turn, Katrina directed them onto a long dirt road, barely more than 2 ruts in the earth, covered in overgrowth. Branches scraped against the sides of the car, creating an eerie scratching sound. The headlights bounced and swayed, revealing glimpses of tangled vegetation and darkness. Then, at the end, there stood an old, dilapidated cabin. The structure sagged to one side, its windows dark and broken, the front porch half collapsed. Vines had consumed much of the exterior, and the whole place radiated abandonment and decay. Ruby turned in her seat, concern flooding her features. "Sweetie, are you sure this is—" The back seat was empty. Ruby's words died in her throat. She blinked, leaning forward to look more carefully. No child, no yellow dress, no red hair, nothing but empty leather seats. "Where did she go?" Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she locked eyes with Brett. He was already looking in the rearview mirror, his face pale in the dashboard light. I didn't hear the door open, did you?" "No." Ruby's hands trembled. "Brett, I didn't hear anything." They sat in silence for a long moment, the engine idling, headlights illuminating the rotting cabin ahead. Brett's hand moved to the door lock, checking it. It was still engaged. The child lock in the back was activated. There was no way the girl could have opened the door without them hearing or seeing it.
"Do you think—"
Ruby's voice was low, almost fearful.
"Do you think that was the girl from the urban legend?"
Brett stared at the cabin, his mind racing. The red hair, the name Katrina, the impossible disappearance. "I don't know what that was," he admitted. "But we need to call the police. If there really was a missing girl from here, if this is where she was taken..." Ruby nodded quickly, already pulling out her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?"
"My name is Ruby Patterson. My husband and I picked up a little girl on Dove Highway about 20 minutes ago. She directed us to a location and then she disappeared from our car. We think it might be connected to an old missing persons case. We need officers to search the area."
Within 30 minutes, the dark highway was alive with flashing red and blue lights. Multiple patrol cars had responded, along with a canine unit. Brett and Ruby stood beside their car, wrapped in blankets despite the warm night air, conversing with the lead officer, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Morrison, who had been with the department for over 30 years. "You said the girl told you her name was Katrina?" Morrison asked, his pen poised over his notepad.
"Yes,"
Ruby confirmed.
"She had bright red hair and was wearing a yellow dress."
Morrison's face went pale. He looked up at his partner, Officer Chen, who had gone equally still. "That matches the description of Katrina Hollis. She went missing from a home about 3 miles from here in 1987. Never found. Never solved." Ruby felt her blood run cold.
1987? But she looked like she was 9 or 10 years old.
"She was 9 when she disappeared," Morrison said quietly. "Red hair, yellow dress. Last seen playing in her yard. Her mother insisted she saw a man in a dark truck, but we never found any evidence. The case went cold." The sergeant turned toward the dilapidated cabin, shining his flashlight over the structure. I know this place. It's the old Hendricks property. Been abandoned since the early 80s. Eldridge Hendricks was a recluse, died in '86. The property's been sitting empty ever since. Couldn't find any heirs. Search it, Morrison ordered. Officers fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The canine unit, 2 cadaver dogs named Duke and Bella, strained at their leashes, immediately interested in the area. The dogs led their handlers away from the cabin itself, toward an area behind the structure where the ground was slightly raised. 20 minutes later, the call came. "We found something!" Ruby grabbed Brett's hand as they watched officers converge on a spot about 50 yards behind the cabin. Sergeant Morrison jogged over, then stopped abruptly. Even from a distance, Brett and Ruby could see him remove his hat and bow his head. Morrison returned slowly, his face grim. "We found human remains. Small, buried shallow. The forensics team is on the way," but he looked at Ruby with something like reverence in his eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, I think you may have just solved a case that's been open for nearly 40 years. Ruby's tears came suddenly, hot and fast. Brett pulled her close, his own eyes wet. They had done nothing but offer a ride to a child who needed help, a child who, they now understood, had been asking for help for decades. Over the following weeks, the story made national news. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains were those of Katrina Hollis, missing since 1987. Further investigation of the property revealed evidence linking Eldridge Hendricks to her disappearance. He had died of a heart attack just months after Katrina vanished, taking his secret to the grave. Until now. Ruby and Brett attended Katrina's funeral when her remains were finally laid to rest beside her mother, who had died in 2003, still believing her daughter would come home. The small cemetery was filled with people who remembered the case, who had never forgotten the little girl with red hair. As they stood at the graveside, Ruby felt a gentle touch on her hand. Warm, brief, and undeniably real. She looked down and saw nothing, but she knew. She knew with absolute certainty. "Thank you," Ruby whispered to the empty air. A breeze stirred through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and something else. The faint, sweet smell of childhood innocence, finally at peace. Brett squeezed his wife's hand. They had driven down Dove Highway hundreds of times before, and they would drive it hundreds of times more. But they would never see the ghost girl again. Katrina Hollis had found her way home at last.